Well, hello everybody. I'm Nick Thorpe, and I'm a British travel writer and journalist, and I have a fascination with risk-taking. So this is one of the risks I've taken, one of the slightly sillier risks. That's me on the plane, and it was terrifying, exhilarating, and slightly pointless. And it surprises those who know me in everyday life because the last thing they would call me is reckless. In fact, I think the nearest anybody's come to that was an ex-girlfriend who once told me I was a real warrior. Well, that was great. I mean, nobody had ever told me that before. I really boosted my ego, and until I realized that actually I'd misheard her, and she actually said a real warrior. And she was right. All my life, people have told me that I should just try and relax a little, stop thinking so hard about everything. But despite this anxiety, or maybe because of it, I have this compulsion to stretch myself, to push myself into the present moment. And believe me, you're definitely in the present moment when you're strapped to a plane. But what's changed over the years, I think, is that I've learned to take a different kind of risk. Slowly but surely, I'm learning to take, I think, more meaningful risks. And that's the journey I'd like to share with you today. So it all began about 10 years ago, really. I was traveling through Bolivia in search of adventure and newspaper articles to write. And I was traveling on a very old bus, but eavesdropping on a very interesting conversation. A few rows in front, a backpacker seemed to me to be talking about a trip to sail 4,000 miles to Easter Island on a boat made of dried reeds. Well, definitely a good story. Although when I got to the construction site on the shores of Lake Titicaca, I was a little bit puzzled to find out that the crew actually so far included a jewelry salesman, a tree surgeon, and the captain, who was actually a mountaineer. Well, that's the whole point, he said. It's an experiment. And to make matters worse, I discovered that reed boats have this tendency to sink, little by little, from the moment they enter the water. And yet I found this trip absolutely irresistible. So much so that when a spare place came up on the crew, I volunteered immediately. I mean, as a writer, I was no worse qualified than anybody else. And I felt I was answering, in stepping onto that boat, I was answering some kind of primal call that I didn't quite understand. So what was going on? Well, I'll come back to this voyage in a minute, but first let's take a short detour. Because it turns out I'm not the only one who's a little conflicted over risk-taking. On the one hand, you can't pick up a newspaper without getting the impression that we're under threat from everything, really. I mean, from the wrong car seat, swine flu, bad weather. Really, you'd think that life itself is basically a safety hazard. And yet this anxious nannying has a strange flip side. Whether it's the bored office worker who goes bungee jumping on holiday, or the family values politician who's always the one who has a fling, I think we're programmed in some way to seek out the adventure that's missing from our everyday lives. And the experts call this risk compensation. So there's a famous experiment, for example, which showed how the introduction of anti-lock braking systems in cars to stop skidding actually failed to reduce traffic accidents. Because it turns out when we know we can stop faster, we stop quicker, we drive quicker. So in other words, you take away one risk and we just replace it with another, even if that means climbing aboard a floating bundle of reeds. So it seems to me that despite all our attempts to abolish it, risk-taking is kind of hardwired into us. I mean, little children don't learn to walk without taking the risk of falling over. It's what makes us alive, it's how we grow. So perhaps our task is not so much to eliminate risks as to choose which ones are worth taking. In my case, I think the physical dangers I faced aboard the reed boat Viracocha turned out to be a disguise for slightly more important lessons. So forget about the threat of sharks or sinking. They seem frankly minor alongside the emotional risk of sharing a small boat with 7 other guys for 6.5 weeks, as it turned out. Because I like to be in control. And unfortunately, you can't cover all the risks when you're sailing through the night. I had to learn to share, to ask for help. And that was my biggest challenge. And it was fantastic. I will never forget pulling in this tuna. I will never forget sitting under the stars, under the universe at the steering platform, just chatting to these guys in a way that I found very difficult back in my ordinary life in Edinburgh. And together we made it to Easter Island. Now, my wife's always a little bit bemused that I felt it necessary to risk my life crossing the Pacific in order to have this deep connection with men. Women, apparently, they just need a coffee and a little chat. And she has a point, because rather like these Easter Island statues, I think we men sometimes have this tendency to want to try and look very impressive and self-contained. But I have a suspicion that sometimes we end up feeling slightly lonely. Well, I didn't want to live like that anymore. I was getting a taste for emotional risk-taking. In fact, when I got the opportunity to do another journey, I actually tried to base the whole journey around those same emotional risks. This time, did it a bit closer to home. It was 4,000 kilometers again, by coincidence. And I went round Scotland's canals, rivers, and coastline. And actually, as I had no boat of my own, the whole point was I had to ask for help on other people's boats. And I hitched rides on 40 different boats. What was amazing was just how open people were to that. I was very touched by the just innate human kindness. And as an Englishman living in Scotland, which, is always a bit dicey, it completely changed my relationship with my country, with my adopted country. And for the first time, I felt like I belonged as a participant, not just an observer. In fact, unexpectedly, the real risk turned out to be finding something out about my relationship with myself, not so much on the journey itself, but in the process of writing about it afterwards. We talked about the voices earlier on, and writing a book is when my inner critic really kicks in. And on this book, he pretty much ambushed me. I remember being hunched in front of my desk, goading myself forward. I was nearly finished, but the voices were saying, it's going to be rubbish. You're going to fail. Try harder, try harder. Maybe some of you recognize those voices. Well, one morning, I hit a wall. I physically couldn't type another word. It was a frightening experience for me because I've always done everything by sheer willpower. And it suddenly dawned on me that willpower, a bit like oil, is actually a limited resource. And mine had just run out. I should have gone to see a doctor, but I really couldn't face a nice, polite suggestion that I stop worrying. And again. And actually, in the background, my wife and I had been trying for quite some time to start a family without any success. And that all felt like the same powerlessness. I couldn't force myself to do things. And so I surrendered. I decided I'd have to blow some deadlines, let some people down. Nobody died. If I was going to avoid a complete breakdown, I needed to stop bullying myself and find another way. Well, my first clue to what that might look like was my dog, Charlie. Like all animals, he lives entirely in the moment, like a kind of Zen master. And as I recovered, I really envied him. I decided to spend a year seeking out people and experiences who could help me get that balance back into my life and let go a little, like my dog. Well, out of habit, I went back to my old friend adrenaline with the drug I knew best from all my other adventures. And that's when I went wing walking, and I also threw myself off a cliff in Cornwall, which was very therapeutic. Because when you're in free fall, you're just here now, screaming. There's no list of worries. But it's not really very sustainable as an ongoing form of meditation. So next, a friend recommended I take some more emotional risk by doing a clowning workshop. Yeah. So you can see how much I was looking forward to that. Clowning turns out to be a bit like wing walking, except that it's your ego plunging towards the ground. Imagine being forbidden to speak and then pushed out onto a stage like this with just a red nose and told to entertain. It was absolutely terrifying, and I stood there, and little by little, the fear gave way to a kind of playfulness. And suffice to say, by the end of the day, I was wearing a ballerina's tutu and a policeman's helmet. Well, my wife rather liked what she saw, not the tutu, but this new vulnerability. And she decided to encourage me further along that road with some tickets to a naturist convention. This isn't us. This isn't us. I thought I'd spare you that particular image and spare us too, because by the time we got to the campsite, we were panicking. But we whipped our clothes off before we could think about it, strode up into the welcome marquee, only to find that everybody else still had their clothes on. It's like one of those nightmares. Yeah, I'm sure you've had them. Anyway, they were very kind about it, and soon the sun came out and everybody else got naked too. And after 10 minutes, it actually became quite relaxing, even quite moving. The sheer diversity of bodies. They're so unlike all these airbrushed, cloned images you get in Sunday magazines, or indeed this painting. There was nothing sleazy about it. In fact, it felt more like the innocence of being a child again, or the Garden of Eden before we learnt to be ashamed of ourselves. And I felt sad, thinking how I'd grown so wary and self-critical as I'd grown up. It made me wonder if the most wonderful risk of all might just be to trust myself a little bit more. Well, this man, a Scotsman called A.S. Neil, decided to do just that. After his own very repressive education, he decided to experiment with what would happen if you let children just be themselves. All it required, he wrote, was a complete belief in the child as a good, not an evil being. Well, Summerhill School is still going 90 years on, so I went somewhat skeptically to see how it worked. And I was met at the gate by these two 10-year-olds wielding plastic machine guns, which didn't bode that well. But it didn't seem to bother the headmistress. She's the one in the middle, the daughter of A.S. Neil. She said they'd grow out of it. They always do. And I met a boy who'd been sent there with attention deficit disorder. No other school could handle him. And he'd been a bit surprised when the headmistress had said, just let me take your medication. You don't need that anymore. Why don't you go off and play bandits in the woods for as long as you need? Well, 2 years later, he finally got a little bit curious about what all the other pupils were doing and decided to go to lessons, and now there's no stopping him. So it's not anarchy at Summerhill. It's basically an experiment in child regulation and child democracy. Self-regulation, I guess. This is one of the regular meetings in the school where the pupils get to make the rules. So, once every few years, somebody will have the bright idea, let's abolish bedtimes. It's a boarding school. And the staff will roll their eyes because they've seen that before. But, they easily get outvoted by the kids, and everybody abolishes bedtime, and 3 days later is totally exhausted and votes to reinstate bedtime. So, lesson learned. I mean, even the British government inspectors have noticed, have written a glowing report about this school. And pupils here tend to leave motivated, mature, and basically at peace with the world. And just out of interest, there's no rule currently about wearing pajamas during the daytime. This is a little boy who wears pajamas all day, because he can. So, is there a magic formula for taking the kind of risks that help us to grow like this? Well, in ancient folklore, the alchemist needed an unbreakable container to change base metals to gold. And on my journey of risk-taking, I've noticed that all my favorite risks have around them what you might call a safe container. So, on the wing walking, my harness meant that it was exhilarating rather than suicidal. And on the naturist thing, the social risk-taking, basically the culture of naturism says you don't point, you don't even acknowledge that the emperor is wearing no clothes. And when it got to the more emotional risk of Summerhill, as we've seen, they had this meeting which contained things that helped them to take risks and push boundaries. But of course, we don't always have these safe conditions. In fact, for most of our evolutionary history, risks have come at us like wild animals, or famine or disaster. And even now, most of the world really has the luxury of being able to premeditate risk, of follow this course I've been describing, from physical to social to emotional risk. So how do we trust ourselves to take meaningful risks in the face of the world's chaos? Well, I think it depends on what Einstein called the biggest question of all. He said, is the universe friendly? Despite everything, dare we take the risk of treating life itself as a safe container? Well, interestingly, the last time I was here in Romania, I was interviewing survivors of Auschwitz. On one level, enough evidence of human depravity and evil to stop us ever trusting ourselves again. But the psychotherapist Viktor Frankl, a Holocaust survivor, who lost his whole family at Auschwitz, wrote, "Everything can be taken from a man except one thing, the freedom to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances." And those I spoke to and Viktor Frankl had chosen hope. And I guess we're talking spiritual risk here. Can we believe the best of ourselves despite the darkness, without ignoring the darkness? And Frankl also suggests that it's hard to do this on our own. Our happiness ultimately depends, he says, on reaching out to others. In fact, surrendering somehow to a power bigger than ourselves, something bigger than ourselves, a love. Well, at the end of my year of experimentation, I felt I needed to take that gamble for a very specific reason. Because behind the scenes, my wife and I were going through the process of adoption. And not long after I got home, we took the step of welcoming a little 3-year-old boy into our family. He's 7 now. And he's changed my life in a way no ocean adventure ever could. He calls on me constantly to take the risk of intimacy, coaxes me to play rather than plan, pushes me into all kinds of unnerving new situations. Never mind wing walking. How do you stay in the moment with a tantrum in the car park? Or the little whispered question last thing at night, "Daddy, what happens when you die?" So, as my son slowly unfurls from the kind of trauma that no child should have to suffer, it's my job as his dad to build him a safe haven from which he can grow and launch himself into life. He's like all of us. Some days we're safety seekers, other days we're risk takers, trusting ourselves to push those boundaries and see what happens, like the kids at Summerhill. And what if our mistakes, our so-called failings, are actually part of growth? When I can believe that, I lose my fear. I've noticed I feel anything is possible. I'm open. Of course, some Worrier's habits never really go away, and I guess I'll never be quite as chilled out as my dog. But on a good day, I remember I can ask for help, I can surrender to something bigger than myself, and I can take the risk of accepting myself despite everything. And that, of course, is the biggest change of all. Thank you very much.